Okay, this is Business 342, lecture, workbook lecture, page 75. It just says expected versus unexpected returns. Realized returns are generally not equal to expected returns. Total return equals the expected return plus unexpected returns. Okay, so at any point, the unexpected return can either be positive or negative. So you have your expected return, you figure out an expected return, but things happen. You know, things happen to your company, things happen to the economy. So that's the unexpected return part of it, of a total return. The unexpected return can either be positive or negative. That, for instance, the economy can pick up, which would probably increase, it would be something that would increase your total return, or it could go down. And that's just an example. Things can happen to your company that you weren't expecting. Flood could wipe out your building, things like that. The important thing to know is, even though the unexpected return can be positive or negative, over time the average of expected component is 0. Okay? So total return differs from the expected return because the surprises are news, announcements, and news contain both expected component and a surprise component. So, you know, the can contain part of the expected components. For instance, you could expect, when you figured out your expected return, you could figure that you thought the economy was going to grow at 2%. The news in the future could tell you that the economy grew at 2%. So that's something that contained part of your expected return component. A surprise could be the economy grew at 8%, which would be a surprise component. There's a bunch of different things that make that up. Nothing too much to get concerned about. Discounted information is information that is already included in the expected return. That's, for instance, why I was telling you, if when they were figuring out their expected return, they'd figure a 2% growing economy, and it turned out to be a 2% growing economy, then it's already discounted, which means it's already figured into the information they used to figure out the expected return. Whereas a surprise can affect the stock and therefore its return, and that's a surprise component. And that's if you had, for instance, like I was saying, an 8% growing economy, a GDP. Well, that would increase the stock's price because that wasn't discounted, that wasn't figured in because they were expecting 2%. For instance, pick some stock prices. Stock prices move, for instance, stock prices move when an unexpected announcement is made on earnings or different from the anticipation. There's a bunch of different expected and unexpected returns. Risk of surprises. There are two kinds of surprises. Okay, systematic risk is a surprise that affects a large number of assets, although at a varying degree. It's sometimes called market risk. Changes in the GDP, interest rates, inflation. See, that affects pretty much everything to one extent or another. It could have very little effect, it could have a lot of effect, but it affects everything. It's called non-diversifiable. So systematic risk is something that affects pretty much everything, and there's no way to really diversify away from that. Unsystematic risk is a surprise that affects a small number of assets, or one. It's sometimes called a unique, diversifiable, or asset-specific risk. Like strikes to a company. If a company has a labor strike, certain accidents, you know, if a company like BP, British Petroleum, had that oil leak, that only affected BP. The strikes to a company only affect a company. So those are called unsystematic risks because they just pertain to a certain company or a certain portion of companies in a different type of business, in the same type of business, excuse me. So total risk equals systematic risk, which is risk that is really undiversifiable, which affects pretty much everything to one extent or another. And unsystematic risk, which just affects certain companies or stocks. Standard deviation of the return is a measure of total risk. So this is talking about total risk, is made up of two parts, systematic and unsystematic. So remember, standard deviation makes up total risk. Beta is just the systematic risk. We'll go into that later. The unsystematic risk can be diversified with a diversified portfolio to basically 0. That's why beta is just a measure of systematic risk. Some firms have high levels of systematic risk in that they respond a lot to changes in the market conditions. Other firms have a low level of risk. And they're talking about high-tech industries have a high beta. We'll talk about beta later, but a high response to systematic risk. So they're very volatile. Whereas like a food company, guys that make milk, or companies like Walmart that sell food, they don't have as big a problem with level of systematic risk because that really doesn't affect their purchasing that much. That's what beta is for. Beta will tell you how much relative systematic risk you have compared to the whole, like S&P 500 or the whole market. Okay, so we'll move over to page 76. Talk about diversification. So diversification, portfolio diversification is the investment in several different assets, classes, or sectors. Remember, if you invest in every stock in the same business, you're really not going to diversify. That's not getting diversification. If you invested all in, say, companies that make guns, if you invested in Winchester, you invested in Smith & Wesson, you invested in Sig Sauer, you're really not diversifying yourself. So you're not going to get rid of that unsystematic risk when the gun control laws come out and cut down on the amount of guns people can purchase. That's not diversifying. Diversifying is diversifying between classes or sectors so that you get rid of a lot of the risk that you're not all in the same type of company. You're not all in the same type of asset. Okay, so diversification can substantially reduce the variability of returns without an equivalent reduction in expected returns. So your returns might be the same, but your risk to getting those returns will be a lot lower. This reduction in risk arises because worse than expected returns from one asset are offset by better than expected returns from another. So what they're saying with unsystematic risk is it could be something positive that comes out of that too, not just negative news or negative things that happen to the company. It could be positive also. So those tend to zero out when you diversify. It says a typical single stock on the New York Stock Exchange has a standard deviation of annual returns around 49%. So that's just an individual stock. Has a typical standard deviation of 49%, while a typical large portfolio of New York Stock Exchange stocks has a standard deviation of about 20%. So you could even go to something like the Standard & Poor's 500, top 500 companies, the S&P 500. That has a standard deviation of a little below 20%. So you don't have to invest in thousands of stocks. Actually, you can invest about 20 and get real close to that 20%. So the farther you go down, if you invest in 500 or 1,000, you don't get much below that. And that's because there's a certain systematic risk involved. So you can't diversify everything. What you can't diversify is because of the systematic risk, the general risk for big events that can happen. You may not get the benefits of diversification by holding a lot of assets. For example, if you own 20 different internet stocks, since they're all highly correlated, that's where correlation comes in. If the stocks are highly correlated, then you're not going to get as much risk reduction from diversification. But if you own 20 stocks that span 10 different industries, then you'll get well diversified. And so that's what they're talking about. That's what correlation tells you, or covariance in correlation tell you, is how closely correlated stocks are. And the closer they are correlated, the less you're going to be able to reduce the risk. Okay, so they're talking about there's a minimum level of risk that cannot be diversified away. So here's showing a slope: total risk, market risk. They call it market risk, which is the systematic risk. Total, remember, standard deviation is made up of systematic and unsystematic. There's a certain amount of market risk that you're not going to be able to diversify away. That's the systematic risk. The total risk, the unsystematic part of it, you can diversify away if you diversify correctly between different types of businesses and such. And so you can see the larger the number of stocks that are different, the more you get closer to the market risk. You're not going to be able to get below the market risk. Okay, so it says, for a well-diversified portfolio, systematic risk is very small. Consequently, the total risk for a diversified portfolio is essentially equivalent to the systematic risk. Okay, and systematic risk is going to be measured, and they'll talk about it, by beta. Market risk is considered a beta of 1, and then the other companies are compared to that. In general, 90% of the benefits from diversification are derived from a portfolio from 12 to 18 firms, but they got to be diversified. Again, they can't be all in the same type of business. Another study suggests 30. Okay, so that's page 76 of your workbook for Business 342. 75 and 76 for your workbook for Business 342.